You pour milk into your coffee without thinking. You splash it over cereal, melt it into cheese, spread it across warm bread as butter, and stir it into countless recipes without ever questioning where it came from. Milk has become so ordinary that it almost feels inevitable. When someone simply says milk, you instinctively picture a cow, not a goat, not a camel, certainly not a reindeer or a yak. But that assumption hides one of the most fascinating stories in human history. Every mammal on Earth produces milk. More than 5,000 species, from tiny bats to enormous blue whales, have evolved their own version of this remarkable food, each perfectly tailored to nourish their young. So why did humanity settle on just one animal as its primary dairy source? Why cows instead of deer? Why not horses, elephants, or zebras? And if cows became the global standard, why do millions of people across the world still rely on the milk of goats, sheep, camels, buffalo, or even mares? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Perhaps cow's milk is simply the healthiest, the most nutritious, or the easiest to digest. But none of those explanations tells the full story. The real answer lies far deeper, woven through thousands of years of evolution, ancient farming experiments, genetic mutations, and the remarkable partnership that developed between humans and a handful of domesticated animals. To understand why one species came to dominate our breakfast tables, you first have to understand something surprisingly simple. Milk was never created for us. In fact, it wasn't even designed to feed every young animal of the same species. From an evolutionary perspective, milk is an extraordinarily specialized biological invention, created to solve one problem, and one problem only: keeping a newborn mammal alive during the most vulnerable stage of its life. That sounds simple, but evolution rarely creates one-size-fits-all solutions. Every mammal enters the world with different challenges, different growth rates, and different environments to survive. As those needs changed over millions of years, so did the milk itself. What we casually call milk is actually thousands of different biological recipes, each carefully refined by natural selection for a particular species. All milk contains the same basic ingredients: water, fat, protein, and lactose, the sugar unique to milk, but the proportions vary dramatically. Those differences are not random. They reflect the life each young animal is expected to live. Human babies, for example, develop slowly. Our brains continue growing for years after birth, and we remain dependent on adults far longer than almost any other mammal. Human milk reflects that strategy. It contains relatively high levels of lactose, providing a steady supply of energy for the developing brain, while keeping protein levels comparatively low to support gradual physical growth. A calf faces a completely different challenge. Within hours of being born, it needs to stand, walk, and follow its mother across open ground. Cow's milk therefore contains more protein and a different balance of nutrients that supports rapid muscle development rather than prolonged brain growth. Move into even harsher environments, and the differences become extraordinary. Seal pups are born into freezing oceans where survival depends on building a thick layer of insulating blubber almost immediately. Their mothers produce milk that is nearly half fat, a nutritional powerhouse that allows pups to gain weight at astonishing speed. Whale milk follows a similar pattern, delivering enormous amounts of energy to calves growing in cold marine environments. High in the Himalayas, yaks produce milk containing over twice the fat of ordinary cow's milk, helping calves withstand freezing temperatures while providing the rich butter that has sustained human communities on the Tibetan Plateau for centuries. Even farther north, reindeer produce one of the richest milks known among domesticated mammals, packed with roughly 22% fat to fuel calves through the unforgiving Arctic landscape. Seen through the lens of evolution, these differences tell the same story. Milk is not simply food. It is an adaptive blueprint, rewritten over millions of years to match the demands of each species' environment. And once you realize that every mammal produces its own custom formula, an even bigger question begins to emerge. If every kind of milk is uniquely designed for its own young, how did humans ever end up drinking the milk of another species in the first place? For most of human history, they weren't. The key lies in a sugar found in every type of mammalian milk called lactose. Lactose is the primary carbohydrate in milk, providing a readily available source of energy for growing infants. But unlike ordinary table sugar, lactose cannot be absorbed directly by the body. It first has to be broken apart by an enzyme called lactase, produced in the lining of the small intestine. Every newborn mammal makes plenty of lactase. Without it, drinking its mother's milk would be impossible. But evolution is remarkably economical. Once a young mammal is weaned, milk disappears from its diet forever, so continuing to manufacture lactase wastes energy. As a result, the genes controlling lactase production gradually switch off after childhood. That pattern is nearly universal across mammals. A lion cub gradually loses the ability to digest milk. So does a young elephant, a wolf, a chimpanzee, and a whale. Early humans followed exactly the same biological program. Children could digest milk, adults largely could not. For thousands of generations, this wasn't a problem because adults weren't expected to drink milk. Then, humans changed their own environment. Around 10,000 years ago, communities in parts of the Fertile Crescent and neighboring regions began domesticating animals such as sheep, goats, and eventually cattle. For the first time, fresh milk became available long after infancy. It represented a valuable source of calories, protein, fat, and clean hydration, all renewable as long as the herd survived. But biology hadn't caught up with culture. Most adults who drank large amounts of fresh milk experienced bloating, cramps, and digestive discomfort because lactose passed undigested into the large intestine, where bacteria fermented it. Yet within these early farming populations, a rare genetic mutation appeared. Instead of allowing lactase production to shut down after childhood, this mutation kept the enzyme active throughout life. At first, it was an insignificant genetic variation carried by only a handful of individuals. But in communities that depended on dairy animals, it became an enormous advantage. Adults who could digest fresh milk gained access to extra nutrition during famines, droughts, and harsh winters. They were more likely to survive, raise children, and pass the mutation to the next generation. Over centuries, and then millennia, the gene spread with astonishing speed. Today, more than 90% of people in many northern European populations retain lactase throughout adulthood, while in regions with little history of dairying, such as much of East Asia, adult lactase persistence remains comparatively uncommon. Similar genetic adaptations also evolved independently among several pastoralist societies in Africa, demonstrating that evolution arrived at the same solution more than once. This is one of the clearest examples of human evolution unfolding in real time. We often imagine evolution as something that happened only to our distant ancestors, but the rise of dairying shows otherwise. Humans didn't simply domesticate cattle. In a very real sense, cattle helped reshape human biology, turning a rare genetic mutation into one of the defining adaptations of entire populations. If that mutation had been the only solution, dairy would probably have remained a minor part of the human diet. Genetic evolution is slow. Even under strong natural selection, a beneficial mutation takes many generations to spread through a population. Early herding communities couldn't afford to wait centuries for biology to catch up. So they found another solution. Instead of changing themselves, they changed the milk. Long before anyone understood bacteria or enzymes, ancient farmers discovered that milk left under the right conditions transformed into entirely new foods. Sometimes it thickened into yogurt. Sometimes it separated into curds and whey, becoming cheese. These discoveries were almost certainly accidental. Milk stored in containers made from animal stomachs, which naturally contain the enzyme rennet, would have curdled on its own. Rather than throwing it away, someone eventually tasted it and discovered it was not only edible, but in many ways even more useful than fresh milk. This changed everything about dairy. During fermentation, beneficial bacteria feed on lactose, converting much of the milk sugar into lactic acid. The process gives yogurt its distinctive tang while dramatically reducing the amount of lactose remaining. Cheese takes the transformation even further. As curds separate from whey, much of the lactose leaves with the liquid, and during aging, microbes continue consuming what little remains. Hard cheeses that mature for months contain only tiny traces of lactose, making them digestible even for many people who cannot tolerate fresh milk. In other words, humans learned to outsource digestion. Rather than relying entirely on their own bodies to break down lactose, they recruited microscopic organisms to do part of the work before the milk ever reached their stomachs. It was an elegant solution, developed thousands of years before anyone knew microbes even existed. This means one of the most common assumptions about dairy history is actually backwards. It wasn't the genetic mutation for lactase persistence that made dairying possible. Dairying was already flourishing because people had discovered ways to transform milk into foods that most adults could eat regardless of their genetics. Only later did natural selection begin rewarding the relatively few individuals who could also drink fresh milk without discomfort. What followed was an extraordinary partnership between culture and biology. Every generation that kept larger herds made fresh milk more valuable. Every generation in which fresh milk became more important increased the advantage of carrying the lactase persistence mutation. Farming practices influenced evolution, and evolution in turn made those farming practices even more successful. It is one of the clearest examples of gene-culture coevolution ever discovered. Human intelligence produced new food technologies, and those technologies reshaped the selective pressures acting on the human genome itself. Our ancestors didn't simply adapt to their environment, they transformed it, and then spent thousands of years adapting to the world they had created. That same partnership between people and domesticated animals also explains something equally remarkable: why different regions of the world came to depend on entirely different kinds of milk. That relationship looked very different depending on where people lived. There was never a single dairy culture. Instead, humans partnered with whichever animals could survive the local landscape, and each environment shaped its own traditions around the milk those animals produced. In the rocky hills of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, cattle were often impractical. Goats, however, thrived where larger livestock struggled. They could browse shrubs instead of grazing lush grass, climb steep slopes, and survive on sparse vegetation. Their milk became the foundation of countless local diets, eventually giving rise to cheeses that remain famous today. The story wasn't simply about taste, it was about an animal perfectly adapted to landscapes where survival demanded resilience. Sheep followed a similar path, but offered something different. Their milk is naturally richer in both fat and protein than cow's milk, making it ideal for producing dense, flavorful cheeses that could be stored for long periods. In societies where preserving food through winter was essential, turning sheep's milk into cheeses such as pecorino, manchego, and traditional feta wasn't merely culinary creativity. It was a practical strategy for surviving seasons when fresh food was scarce. Travel farther south into the deserts of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and cattle begin to disappear. Water is limited, temperatures soar, and vast grasslands give way to arid plains. Camels, not cows, became the animals capable of sustaining human life. Their milk contains a different nutritional balance, including more vitamin C than cow's milk. And for thousands of years, it provided a dependable food source where few other large domesticated animals could survive. In these landscapes, camel's milk was not an alternative. It was the obvious choice. High above sea level, another partnership emerged. On the Tibetan Plateau, where thin air, freezing temperatures, and rugged terrain challenge both people and livestock, yaks became indispensable. Their rich, high-fat milk reflects the demands of raising calves in extreme cold, while humans transformed it into butter that fueled daily life in one of Earth's harshest inhabited environments. Even the region's famous butter tea exists because both people and animals adapted to the same unforgiving climate. Across the endless grasslands of Central Asia, mobility mattered more than permanent settlements. Nomadic herders depended on horses, and their mares produced milk rich in lactose, making it ideal for fermentation. The result was kumis, a lightly alcoholic drink that was nutritious, easier to preserve, and better suited to people who often lacked lactase persistence. Here again, the environment shaped the food, and the food shaped the culture. In South Asia, the story belonged largely to water buffalo. Better suited than cattle to hot, humid conditions and flooded fields, buffalo became the dominant dairy animals across many regions. Their milk is naturally richer than cow's milk, producing exceptionally creamy butter, yogurt, and the traditional mozzarella that first originated from buffalo rather than cattle. Far to the north, where winters seem endless, reindeer supplied one of the richest milks produced by any domesticated mammal. Every drop was packed with energy because reindeer calves needed to grow quickly before the Arctic cold tightened its grip. Meanwhile, around the Mediterranean, donkey's milk occupied a completely different niche. Remarkably similar to human breast milk in several respects, it was once used to feed infants when mothers or wet nurses could not. Seen together, these traditions reveal a remarkable pattern. Humans never searched for the best milk. They embraced the milk of the animals that had already mastered the environments they called home. Geography chose the animal, evolution shaped its milk, and human ingenuity turned both into culture. Yet despite this extraordinary diversity, one question remains. Why did cows, above all the others, become the world's dominant dairy animal? The answer has surprisingly little to do with nutrition. Cow's milk is not objectively superior. Sheep's milk contains far more fat and protein. Camel's milk provides more vitamin C. Yak milk is richer in calories, and donkey's milk resembles human milk more closely than cow's does. If humans had chosen their primary dairy animal based purely on nutritional value, the winner might have been someone else entirely. Instead, cows excelled in something far more important: scale. A modern dairy cow can produce well over 10,000 liters of milk in a year. Even before centuries of selective breeding, cattle produced vastly larger quantities than most other dairy animals. A goat might provide several hundred liters annually, while a sheep produces even less. For growing farming communities trying to feed hundreds or thousands of people, those differences were transformative. Temperament also mattered. Cattle adapted remarkably well to living alongside humans. They could be herded in large numbers, handled regularly, and milked day after day with relatively predictable behavior. They were large enough to supply substantial amounts of milk, yet manageable enough to become a routine part of agricultural life. Many other mammals simply never reached that balance. Geography amplified these advantages. Across much of Europe and Western Asia, vast areas of temperate grassland stretched beyond the fields used for crops. Humans cannot digest grass, but cattle can. Their complex stomachs allow them to convert an otherwise unusable resource into milk and meat, effectively transforming entire landscapes into food-producing systems. Instead of competing with humans for grain, cows often thrived on land that agriculture could not fully exploit. That made cattle the ideal partner for settled civilizations. As villages expanded into towns and towns into cities, societies needed food systems capable of producing reliable surpluses. Cattle supplied milk throughout the year, manure for fertilizing fields, traction for plowing, hides for leather, and eventually meat as well. Few domesticated animals contributed so many resources simultaneously. By the time European societies expanded across the globe over the last 5 centuries, they carried this highly successful agricultural system with them. Cattle spread to the Americas, Australia, and many parts of Africa and Asia, bringing cow's milk into regions that had long relied on different dairy traditions, or none at all. In the end, cows did not conquer the world because they produced the perfect milk. They did so because they became the perfect agricultural partner for large, expanding civilizations. Their global success was driven by productivity, geography, and history, not by any biological verdict that their milk was the best. That history also explains an equally intriguing question. If cows became such successful dairy animals, why didn't humans simply milk every large mammal they encountered? After all, lions produce milk. So do moose, zebras, and kangaroos. In theory, every one of those milks could nourish a human child. Yet almost none of them ever became part of the human diet. The missing ingredient wasn't biology, it was domesticability. Producing milk on a meaningful scale requires far more than finding an animal with edible milk. The animal must tolerate living alongside humans, breed reliably in captivity, allow itself to be handled every day, and produce enough milk to justify the enormous effort of caring for it. Surprisingly, few mammals possess all of those qualities at once. Take lions. A lioness certainly produces rich, nutritious milk for her cubs, but approaching a protective mother every morning with a bucket would be less like farming and more like volunteering to become breakfast. No matter how valuable the milk might be, the risks make the idea impossible. Moose present a different challenge. Their milk is exceptionally rich, and Scandinavian researchers have experimented with milking them. The results proved that it could be done, but only with tremendous effort. Moose are solitary, easily stressed, difficult to manage in herds, and produce relatively small quantities of milk. The economics simply never worked. Zebras seem even more puzzling because they are close relatives of horses, which humans successfully domesticated thousands of years ago. Yet, despite repeated attempts throughout history, zebras resisted domestication. Their unpredictable temperament, powerful flight instincts, and aggressive behavior made them unsuitable for the close, cooperative relationship that dairy farming demands. Then there are kangaroos, whose milk is among the most remarkable in the animal kingdom. A mother kangaroo can produce different kinds of milk simultaneously from separate mammary glands, each tailored to a joey at a different stage of development. It is an extraordinary evolutionary adaptation, but one designed for tiny marsupial offspring, not for supplying a human community. In the end, humans did not choose dairy animals simply because their milk was nutritious. They chose the animals that were willing, or could be persuaded, to live with them. The story of milk has never been just about chemistry. It has always been about relationships between species, and only a handful of mammals possessed the rare combination of temperament, productivity, and adaptability needed to become humanity's lifelong partners. That is why the milk sitting in your refrigerator has a far more remarkable history than its plain white appearance suggests. As European kingdoms expanded across the globe from the 15th century onward, they carried more than languages, religions, and technologies. They also carried cattle. From the Americas to Australia, and eventually to much of Africa and Asia, European farming systems established cows as the foundation of commercial dairying. In many places, they replaced older traditions built around goats, sheep, buffalo, camels, or other local animals. In others, they existed alongside them, gradually becoming the dominant source of milk through industrial agriculture and global trade. It is easy to mistake that dominance for inevitability. We grow up surrounded by cow's milk, so it feels as though history could never have unfolded any other way. But history rarely works that way. If a different group of animals had first been domesticated, if ancient herders had never discovered fermentation, if the mutation allowing adults to digest lactose had failed to spread, if cattle had proven too difficult to manage, the world's dairy culture might look completely different today. Millions of people might be pouring camel's milk over breakfast, drinking fermented mare's milk with dinner, or considering goat's milk the unquestioned standard. Instead, countless small events accumulated across thousands of years. Evolution shaped mammals to produce milk only for their young. Human curiosity transformed that milk into food. Culture changed before genetics did. Genetics then adapted to culture. Agriculture favored cattle, and history carried them across continents. None of those steps was guaranteed. Yet together, they created one of humanity's most familiar foods. The next time you open your refrigerator, you're not simply looking at a carton of milk. You're looking at the outcome of millions of years of mammalian evolution, thousands of years of human experimentation, and centuries of migration, trade, and civilization. Something that feels completely ordinary today exists because of an extraordinary chain of biological adaptations and historical coincidences. The milk in your refrigerator was never inevitable. It is one of history's longest surviving decisions.